If you have not done any real genealogy research on yourself to find out if you had a African ancestor in your family, then you are pretending to be something that you're not by means of using a history book, a history book, which holds no standing in law. They are stories, just nothing but stories, published in the fictional sections of different libraries. You can't take them to court and use those, let's say, for reasons to get reparations, because they're going to ask you for your family records and to prove that you had a African ancestor that came over here through the use of slavery. And then you have genealogy DNA testing, which shouldn't be called genealogy DNA testing. It should be called anthropology DNA testing. And these tests test how similar you are to different groups of populations on the planet, not that you're actually blood related to these groups of people. And also, some of it is called genetic horoscope or genetic horoscopes. And that's a different subject that really puts a little stir in a hole in the whole genealogy scamming, testing, and African ancestry. These people have been scamming Black Americans for a very long time. Even one of their partners have already exposed what them and Rick Kittles are doing in those labs. So, that's really nothing new or nothing to really hide. And then you have the explanation of this, because a lot of people misunderstand me whenever I'm trying to explain to them that these anthropology DNA tests are different from paternity and maternity tests that you would see, let's say, in the Maury show. Paternity and maternity DNA testing test if you're actually blood related to someone, or to a child, or to a mother, or to a father, which is totally different from the anthropology DNA test that these genetic testing companies use. The test that the genetic companies use, the anthropology DNA testing, test how similar you are to people in terms of percentages. Like if you had a result that came back and said that you were 20% European or 80% African, then what that literally means is you're 20% similar to the European population. You're 80% similar to the African population. That's what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean that you had an ancestor from those specific areas. It just doesn't mean that. It's totally different. And even if you wanted to, these genetic companies wanted to use paternity, maternity DNA testing, they would have to dig up all of your dead relatives and then test each ancestor to see if they're blood related. And then again, they would still have to do paper, and they would still have to look at the paper information, the genealogy papers and records on these people to find out who they was, what land they own, if they came over here through immigrants. You cannot avoid records in any of this. You cannot absolutely avoid records. And then on top of that, you can't take these genealogy, anthropology, DNA test to court to prove that, I'm African. It says it right here. Because they're going to still ask you for your ancestry your ancestors' records to prove that you had an ancestor from those areas or from those specific tribes. It's no different from when someone wants to prove that they're Indian to be put on the Indian dolls rolls, which is infiltrated by a lot of white European people who ancestors paid $5 to be put on the Indian dolls rolls. The term for that is called the $5 Indians. You can Google and research those records at the National Archives if you want to. I wouldn't recommend Google, but I would recommend you can Google, let's say, the names of those records and then look at those records at the National Archives to actually see what actually happened, to get a really good primary source. That's a whole nother subject. That's a whole nother video. But you cannot take those anthropology DNA testing tests to court. These tests are no different from testing your DNA or comparing your DNA to rodents and pigs and cows. They share 80 to 90% similar DNA to humans. It's no different from that, but it doesn't mean that you have ancestors from rodents and pigs. Come on now. So it plays a lot into that when it comes to talking about these genetic tests. It's so new and so young, and you can't use that as proof because these genetic companies will have to come back with names of cousins and all these relatives, and then they would have to be using paternity-maternity tests to confirm that you're actually blood related to these people. So my whole thing to everyone out there again is to look at your family records. Okay, find out if you had an African ancestor that immigrated here via slave trade or whatever by means to actually confirm that you have African ancestry in your family. Other than that, the majority of Black Americans' records reflect that they are in fact indigenous to this land. I mean, another point to make on this is, for an example, you can find out if your family owned land in the early to mid 1800s before the Emancipation Proclamation was passed to free slaves from unfair labor. So you can ask yourself this, like, if you had an African ancestor and they were living back then and they owned land, how can an African from another landmass, a slave at that, own land? What happened? How did that even happen? How would that even be possible in the slave narrative that we all know that was going on back then? How can it be possible for an African slave to own land? So these are the questions you should be asking yourself. These are the questions that put holes in his story. It put holes in his whole fictional story. And that's why I say that the records does not reflect what's in his story. It doesn't reflect what's in his storybooks that you look upon when you're at school or when you was a child or what you was taught when you was growing up. These are the things you gotta look at. The National Archives, look at those records because they reflected something totally different from his storybooks. which are nothing but stories and fictions. You want to know records and how this country and what was going on in this country? Look at their records, man. Look at their laws. Look at their records. Look at the U.S. National Archives. That's where it's all at. Those records you can take to court, because those records hold land deeds, land ownership, laws, treaties, vital statistic records. That's the real story of this country, the U.S. National Archives, not history books that have been published in the fictional sections of libraries. If you can't look at your genealogy records and to prove that you had an African ancestor, then you are pretending to be something that you're not.